Hello YouTube, my name is Will, and I'm creating an open world survival game all by myself. And in this video, I'm going to show you the progress that I made in the first month of development. After opening up a new Unity project, I made a box for the ground, because being stuck in a perpetual state of falling doesn't really sound like fun gameplay for an open world game. Oh, and don't worry, the world doesn't end up staying flat, but we'll get to that shortly. Now it's time to add the player. So first we need something to be our player model, so I added a capsule to the scene and renamed it to player. I then wrote some code to get the player to look around, but instead he just wants to fall over and roll. It's good how he's bringing awareness to seizures, but I don't know how fun of a game mechanic that would be. I fixed the code so now he can look anywhere, and right now I think he's looking to see if he has that subscribe button clicked, which you should too, by the way. So now that the player can look around, we need to get him moving. So I wrote even more code to make him move around, and I added a texture to the ground. Now he can move around, but it's very slippery. So I made him less slippery and gave him the ability to sprint. To make the movement seem even more realistic, I implemented a camera bob using everybody's favorite trigonometric function, sine. If you thought trig was completely useless, you must feel pretty silly now, right? Sorry for going off on a little sine over cosine, so let's get back to it. So now let's make the player jump. So after doing some more coding, the player can now jump. But he also walks around in the air, which doesn't really happen all that often in real life. So now that I fixed that, we're just about done with our player and we can switch our focus back to the ground. There's just one tiny problem with that. I don't know how to make terrain. Like, at all. Many research days later, I learned that terrain is made in two ways, voxel and Heightmap. Without going into too much detail, voxel has terrain imported into Unity, while Heightmap uses a black and white image that the computer can generate into terrain on the fly. With both methods, terrain is split into smaller sections known as chunks. Most games use Heightmap for terrain, and only one game in particular really stands out to me is using voxel. It's not that common, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, it's called Minecraft. First, I opened up Blender and made 5 planes. I'll get to why I did that in a little bit. After I imported them into Unity, I made a chunk loading script. If you were wondering what the script does, well, it's kind of confusing, so get ready. Okay, so the chunk loading script loads the chunks. I know, crazy, right? If you're wondering how, well, I can't really tell you because I forgot. So in real life, objects that are far away from you are a lot harder to see than objects really close to you, and the same thing goes for games. So why would I have a super high resolution chunk rendered 300 meters away from the player? It just doesn't make sense. Remember how I made 5 planes in Blender and not 1? Well, that's because each plane represents a different level of detail of one chunk. Using the 5 detail levels of the chunk, I created a level of detail system where chunks rendered far away from the player have lower level of detail than chunks right in front of the player. I also increased the player's viewing distance, and here's what we have. At this point, the game isn't really running as smoothly as I'd like, so after a bit of brainstorming, I thought that the problem was with this bad boy, the CPU. If you're unaware, the CPU is essentially the brain of the computer, and it's responsible for most of the tasks and calculations of the system. It can run multiple tasks simultaneously on different parts of the CPU, known as threads. But right now with my game, everything is happening on one thread, the main thread. So let's fix that. So after 6 days of trying and failing to make the code run on more than one thread, I finally got it working. But it did absolutely nothing for performance. This means the CPU is fine all along, and I wasted 6 days for nothing. Or did I? At least now I know what the real problem is. The GPU can't handle rendering all these high poly terrain chunks. So, I can either make chunks larger with a smaller total number of chunks, or less detailed and keep the same number. And I opted to make the chunks larger. After that, I saw a significant increase in performance. Now it's finally time to get the terrain looking like, well, terrain. So I spent like a minute in Blender just sculpting little hills and divots into a plane, and here's what I got. So as I was doing this, I realized that I would have to sculpt over 6,500 more of these chunks. So I finally understood why most games use Heightmap, and I decided to switch. So the big change now is that I have to generate the meshes in Unity, and I accomplished it by writing a mesh generator script. which generates the mesh, if you are confused on how it works. It's not perfectly working though. We have some problems. First, all the chunks have the same height map, so everything's basically repeated. Next, all the chunks are very low poly, and last, the level of detail system isn't properly working. First things first, I want to get the chunk resolution sorted out. So after some more coding, I now have more vertices per chunk edge, making the resolution a lot higher. But because the level of detail system is still messed up, all the chunks are rendered in the highest level of detail, which is causing the game to slow down a lot. To fix this, we have to introduce a new level of detail system. So I did, and now the game runs a lot smoother. Now I need to give the chunks separate height maps so that each chunk isn't just a repeated version of the previous chunk. And the way I did this was using a Heightmap splitter script. So the Heightmap splitter script splits the height maps up into smaller height maps, so each chunk gets a unique height map. Remember threading, the thing that I took like 6 days on that I didn't need? Well, now I need it, but somewhere else. But now that I'm a pro at it, it only took a couple hours to implement. After I finished, I realized I put the wrong code on the wrong thread. So then I proceeded to Control-Z over an hour of progress. After I had the right code running on the right thread, I finally finished up the Heightmap splitter script. I also gave the chunks colliders so that the player doesn't just fall through the chunks like they did before, which, again, wouldn't make for a fun game mechanic. As you can see, we now have a new problem, the terracing. The terracing is like the little staircases on the slopes. Not good. My genius plan for fixing this is to have 9 different height maps, and each chunk take height map information from the height map sector that it is a part of. The quotations on genius may or may not be foreshadowing. You're just gonna have to wait and see. Using this, I can now have higher detail meshes going along with higher detail height maps. So I started coding and inevitably broke everything. So after I spammed Control-Z, I came up with at least half a plan in my head and started over. This time it worked, and the terracing was a lot better. But it's not 100% fixed. It's good enough for now, but I'm hoping to get it 100% better in the next episode. Now we have another problem. Seams. It seems to me like I really need to fix the seams, because the chunks seem to just want to make seams with each other, which doesn't seem cool to me, because I just want them to be seamless. After what seemed to be forever, I finally got the chunks together seamlessly. As you can see, you can still tell that there are chunks in some places, mainly because the normals don't match up. Normals are basically invisible lines that Unity uses to determine like lighting and shading, I think. I don't really understand how they work in their entirety, or like at all, but I eventually got the system working. Well, kinda. You see, after I wrote the code to fix the normals, the seamless terrain broke, and now we have seams again. Fixing the seams the second time proved to be a lot harder than the first. I had significantly more bugs and things wrong this time. The pattern of fixing one thing and breaking another continued when once I finally fixed the seams, the normals were messed up again. Many hours later, the normals were finally fixed and everything was working properly. At this point, you may be asking yourself, wow, that seemed like a lot of work to get that done. Why didn't you just use the built-in terrain system that Unity has? And my response to that would be, well, Unity's terrain system doesn't work for voxel. And then after I switched to Heightmap, I kind of forgot it was a thing. So, it's too late now. So, now that the terrain system is finally complete, I can start working on sculpting actually good-looking terrain and eventually biomes. But that's a topic for another video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It will really help me out. And if you watched the whole video, you probably at least liked it a little bit, so consider hitting the like button too. Thanks for watching. See you soon.